Good evening, and welcome to Restored Lore, your home for old, odd, and obscure stories. Tonight's story is Curious If True by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell, first published in 1860. It has a bit of an Alice in Wonderland vibe, as our mannered and proper narrator stumbles into a decidedly strange and surreal situation. Although written in English, this story takes place in France and has a lot of French in it. I will put incidental translations and citations on screen for your reference, but there are two passages that I am going to preemptively translate and narrate in English. One passage is rather long, and it would be silly for me to try to pronounce it in French, only for you to have to pause the video and read it in English. And the other passage, well, the other is the climax of the story, and it needs to be in English in order to work for me. Also, I am going to attempt a ridiculous Pepe Le Pew type French accent from time to time, and you'll see why. Now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Extract from a letter from Richard Whittingham, Esquire. You were formerly so much amused at my pride in my descent from that sister of Calvin's who married a Whittingham, Dean of Durham, that I doubt if you'll be able to enter into the regard for my distinguished relation that has led me to France in order to examine registers and archives, which, I thought, might enable me to discover collateral descendants of the great reformer, with whom I might call cousins. I shall not tell you of my troubles and adventures in this research. You are not worthy to hear them, but something so curious befell me one evening last August that if I had not been perfectly certain I was wide awake, I might have taken it for a dream. For the purpose I have named, it was necessary that I should make Tours my headquarters for a time. I had traced descendants of the Calvin family out of Normandy and into the centre of France, but I found it was necessary to have a kind of permission from the bishop of the diocese before I could see certain family papers which had fallen into the possession of the church. And, as I had several English friends at Tours, I awaited the answer to my request to Monseigneur de Blanc at that town. I was ready to accept any invitation, but I received very few, and was sometimes a little at a loss what to do with my evenings. The table d'hôte was 5 o'clock. I did not wish to go to the expense of a private sitting-room, disliked the dinnery atmosphere of the salle à manger, and could not play either at pool or billiards, and the aspect of my fellow guests was unprepossessing enough to make me unwilling to enter into any tête-à-tête gamblings with them. So I usually rose from table early and tried to make the most of the remaining light of the August evenings in walking briskly off to explore the surrounding country. The middle of the day was too hot for this purpose, and better employed in lounging on a bench on the boulevards, lazily listening to a distant band, and noticing with equal laziness the faces and figures of the women who passed by. One Thursday evening, the 18th of August it was, I think, I had gone further than usual in my walk, and found that it was later than I had imagined when I paused to turn back. I fancied I could make a round. I had enough notion of the direction in which I was to see that by turning up a narrow straight lane to my left, I should shorten my way back to Tours. And so I believe I should have done, could I have found an outlet at the right place. But field paths are almost unknown in that part of France, and my lane, stiff and straight as any street, and marked into terribly vanishing perspective by the regular row of poplars on each side, seemed interminable. Of course, night came on, and I was in darkness. In England, I might have had a chance of seeing a light in some cottage only a field or two off, and asking my way from the inhabitants, but here I could see no such welcome sight. Indeed, I believe French peasants go to bed with the summer daylight, so if there were any habitations in the neighbourhood, I never saw them. At last, I believe I must have walked 2 hours in the darkness, I saw the dusky outline of a wood on one side of the weariful lane, and, impatiently careless of all forest laws and penalties for trespassers, I made my way to it, thinking that if the worst came to the worst, I could find some covert, some shelter where I could lie down and rest until the morning light gave me a chance of finding my way back to Tours. But the plantation, on the outskirts of what appeared to me a dense wood, was of young trees, too closely planted to be more than slender stems growing up to a good height, with scanty foliage on their summits. On I went toward the thicker forest, and once there I slackened my pace and began to look about me for a good lair. I was as dainty as Lochiel's grandchild, who made his grandsire indignant at the luxury of his pillow of snow. This brake was too full of brambles, that felt damp with dew. There was no hurry, since I had given up all hope of passing the night between four walls, and I went leisurely, groping about, and trusting that there were no wolves to be poked up out of their summer drowsiness by my stick, when all at once I saw a chateau before me, not a quarter of a mile off, at the end of what seemed to be an ancient avenue, now overgrown and irregular, which I happened to be crossing when I looked to my right and saw the welcome sight. Large, stately, and dark was its outline against the dusky night sky. There were pepper boxes and tourelles and what-not fantastically growing up into the dim starlight, and, more to the purpose still, though I could not see the details of the building that I was now facing, it was plain enough that there were lights in many windows, as if some great entertainment was going on. "They are hospitable people, at any rate," thought I. "Perhaps they will give me a bed. I don't suppose French proprietaires have traps and horses quite as plentiful as English gentlemen, but they are evidently having a large party, and some of their guests may be from Tours and will give me a cast back to the Lion d'Or. I am not proud, and I am dog-tired. I'm not above hanging on behind, if need be." So, putting a little briskness and spirit into my walk, I went up to the door, which was standing open most hospitably, and showing a large lighted hall, all hung round with spoils of the chase, armor, etc., the details of which I had not time to notice, for the instant I stood on the threshold, a huge porter appeared, in a strange, old-fashioned dress, a kind of livery which well befitted the general appearance of the house. He asked me, in French so curiously pronounced that I thought I had hit upon a new kind of patois, my name and whence I came. I thought he would not be much the wiser. Still, it was but civil to give it before I made my request for assistance, so in reply I said, "My name is Whittingham, Richard Whittingham, an English gentleman, staying at—" To my infinite surprise, a light of pleased intelligence came over the giant's face. He made me a low bow, and said, still in the same curious dialect, that I was welcome, that I was long expected. Long expected? What could the fellow mean? Had I stumbled on a nest of relations by John Calvin's side, who had heard of my genealogical inquiries and were gratified and interested by them? But I was too much pleased to be under shelter for the night to think it necessary to account for my agreeable reception before I enjoyed it. Just as he was opening the great heavy battens of the door that led from the hall to the interior, he turned round and said, "Apparently, Monsieur le Géant has not come with you?" "No, I am all alone. I have lost my way." And I was going on with my explanation when he, as if quite indifferent to it, led the way up a great stone staircase, as wide as many rooms, and having on each landing-place massive iron wickets in a heavy framework. These the porter unlocked with the solemn slowness of age. Indeed, a strange, mysterious awe of the centuries that had passed away since this chateau was built came over me as I waited for the turning of the ponderous keys in the ancient locks. I could almost have fancied that I heard a mighty rushing murmur, like the ceaseless sound of a distant sea, ebbing and flowing for ever and for ever, coming forth from the great vacant galleries that opened out on each side of the broad staircase, and were to be dimly perceived in the darkness above us. It was as if the voices of generations of men yet echoed and eddied in the silent air. It was strange, too, that my friend the porter, going before me, ponderously infirm, with his feeble old hands striving in vain to keep the tall flambeau he held steadily before him, strange, I say, that he was the only domestic I saw in the vast halls and passages, or met with on the grand staircase. At length we stood before the gilded doors that led into the saloon where the family, or it might be the company, so great was the buzz of voices, was assembled. I would have remonstrated when I found he was going to introduce me, dusty and travel-smeared, in a morning costume that was not even my best, into this grand salon, with nobody knew how many ladies and gentlemen assembled. But the obstinate old man was evidently bent upon taking me straight to his master, and paid no heed to my words. The doors flew open, and I was ushered into a saloon curiously full of pale light, which did not culminate on any spot, nor proceed from any centre, nor flicker with any motion of the air, but filled every nook and corner, making all things deliciously distinct, different from our light of gas or candle, as the difference between a clear southern atmosphere and that of our misty England. At the first moment, my arrival excited no attention, the apartment was so full of people, all intent on their own conversation. But my friend the porter went up to a handsome lady of middle age, richly attired in that antique manner which fashion has brought round again of late years, and, waiting first in an attitude of deep respect till her attention fell upon him, told her my name and something about me, as far as I could guess from the gestures of one and the sudden glance of the eye of the other. She immediately came towards me with the most friendly actions of greetings, even before she had advanced near enough to speak. Then, and was it not strange, her words and accent were that of the commonest peasant of the country. Yet she herself looked high-bred, and would have been dignified had she been a shade less restless, had her countenance worn a little less lively and inquisitive expression. I had been poking a good deal about the old parts of Tours, and had had to understand the dialect of the people who dwelt in the Marché au Vendredi and similar places, or I really should not have understood my handsome hostess, as she offered to present me to her husband, a henpecked, gentlemanly man, who was more quaintly attired than she in the very extreme of that style of dress. I thought to myself that in France, as in England, it is the provincials who carry fashion to such an excess as to become ridiculous. However, he spoke, still in the patois, of his pleasure in making my acquaintance, and led me to a strange, uneasy easy-chair, much of a piece with the rest of the furniture, which might have taken its place without any anachronism by the side of that in the Hotel Cluny. Then again began the clatter of French voices, which my arrival had for an instant interrupted, and I had leisure to look about me. Opposite to me sat a very sweet-looking lady, who must have been a great beauty in her youth, I should think, and would be charming in old age, from the sweetness of her countenance. She was, however, extremely fat, and on seeing her feet laid up before her on a cushion, I at once perceived that they were so swollen as to render her incapable of walking, which probably brought on her excessive embonpoint. Her hands were plump and small, but rather coarse-grained in texture, not quite so clean as they might have been, and altogether not so aristocratic-looking as the charming face. Her dress was of superb black velvet, ermine-trimmed, with diamonds thrown all abroad over it. Not far from her stood the least little man I had ever seen, of such admirable proportions that no one could call him a dwarf, because with that word we usually associate something of deformity, but yet with an elfin look of shrewd, hard, worldly wisdom in his face that marred the impression which his delicate, regular little features would otherwise have conveyed. Indeed, I do not think he was of quite equal rank with the rest of the company, for his dress was inappropriate to the occasion, and he apparently was an invited, while I was an involuntary guest. And one or two of his gestures and actions were more like the tricks of an uneducated rustic than anything else. To explain what I mean, his boots had evidently seen much service, and had been re-topped, re-heeled, re-soled to the extent of a cobbler's powers. Why should he have come in them if they were not his best, his only pair? And what can be more ungenteel than poverty? Then again he had an uneasy trick of putting his hand up to his throat, as if he expected to find something the matter with it, and he had the awkward habit, which I do not think he could have copied from Dr. Johnson, because most probably he had never heard of him, of trying always to retrace his steps on the exact boards on which he had trodden to arrive at any particular part of the room. Besides, to settle the question, I once heard him addressed as Monsieur Pousset, without any aristocratic de for a prefix, and nearly everyone else in the room was a marquise at any rate. I say nearly everyone, for some strange people had the entrée, unless, indeed, they were, like me, benighted. One of the guests I should have taken for a servant, but for the extraordinary influence he seemed to have over the man I took for his master, and who never did anything without, apparently, being urged thereto by this follower. The master, magnificently dressed, but ill at ease in his clothes, as if they had been made for someone else, was a weak-looking, handsome man, continually sauntering about, and I almost guessed an object of suspicion to some of the gentlemen present, which, perhaps, drove him on the companionship of his follower, who was dressed something in the style of an ambassador's chasseur, yet it was not a chasseur's dress after all, it was something more thoroughly old-world. Boots halfway up his ridiculously small legs, which clattered as he walked along, as if they were too large for his little feet, and a great quantity of grey fur as trimming to a coat, court mantle, boots, cap, everything. You know the way in which certain countenances remind you perpetually of some animal, be it a bird or a beast? Well, this chasseur, as I will call him for want of a better name, was exceedingly like the great tomcat you have seen so often in my chambers, and laughed at almost as often for his uncanny gravity of demeanour. Grey whiskers has my Tom, grey whiskers had the chasseur. Grey hair overshadows the upper lip of my Tom, grey mustachios hid that of the chasseur. The pupil of Tom's eyes dilate and contract as I had thought cats' pupils only could do, until I saw those of the chasseur. To be sure, canny as Tom is, the chasseur had the advantage in the more intelligent expression. He seemed to have obtained almost complete sway over his master or patron, whose looks he watched and whose steps he followed with a kind of distrustful interest that puzzled me greatly. There were several other groups in the more distant part of the saloon, all of the stately old school, all grand and noble, I conjectured from their bearing. They seemed perfectly well acquainted with each other, as if they were in the habit of meeting. But I was interrupted in my observations by the tiny little gentleman on the opposite side of the room coming across to take a place beside me. It is no difficult matter to a Frenchman to slide into conversation, and so gracefully did my pygmy friend keep up the character of the nation that we were almost confidential before 10 minutes had elapsed. Now, I was quite aware that the welcome which all had extended to me, from the porter up to the vivacious lady and meek lord of the castle, was intended for some other person. But it required either a degree of moral courage, of which I cannot boast, or the self-reliance and conversational powers of a bolder and cleverer man than I, to undeceive people who had fallen into so fortunate a mistake for me. Yet the little man by my side insinuated himself so much into my confidence that I had half a mind to tell him of my exact situation, and to turn him into a friend and an ally. "Madame is perceptibly growing older," said he, in the midst of my perplexity, glancing at our hostess. "Madame is still a very fine woman," replied I. "Now, is it not strange," continued he, lowering his voice, "how women almost invariably praise the absent or departed as if they were angels of light, while as for the present or the living—" Here he shrugged up his little shoulders and made an expressive pause. "Would you believe it? Madame is always praising her late husband to Monsieur's face, till, in fact, we guests are quite perplexed how to look, for you know the late Monsieur de Retz's character was quite notorious. Everybody has heard of him." All the world of Touraine, thought I, but I made an assenting noise. At this instant, Monsieur our host came up to me, and with a civil look of tender interest, such as some people put on when they inquire after your mother, about whom they do not care one straw, asked if I had heard lately how my cat was. How my cat was. What could the man mean? My cat? Could he mean the tailless Tom, born in the Isle of Man, and now supposed to be keeping guard against the incursions of rats and mice into my chambers in London? Tom is, as you know, on pretty good terms with some of my friends, using their legs for rubbing posts without scruple, and highly esteemed by them for his gravity of demeanour and wise manner of winking his eyes. But could his fame have reached across the Channel? However, an answer must be returned to the inquiry, as Monsieur's face was bent down to mine with a look of polite anxiety, and so I, in my turn, assumed an expression of gratitude and assured him that, to the best of my belief, my cat was in remarkably good health. "And the climate agrees with her?" "Perfectly," said I, in a maze of wonder at this deep solicitude in a tailless cat who had lost one foot and half an ear in some cruel trap. My host smiled a sweet smile, and, addressing a few words to my little neighbour, passed on. "How wearisome these aristocrats are," quoth my neighbour, with a slight sneer. "Monsieur's conversation rarely extends to more than 2 sentences to any one. By that time his faculties are exhausted, and he needs the refreshment of silence. You and I, monsieur, are, at any rate, indebted to our own wits for our rise in the world." Here again I was bewildered. As you know, I am rather proud of my descent from families which, if not noble themselves, are allied to nobility, and as to my rise in the world, if I had risen, it would have been rather for balloon-like qualities than for mother wit, to being unencumbered with heavy ballast either in my head or my pockets. However, it was my cue to agree, so I smiled again. "For my part," said he, "if a man does not stick at trifles, if he knows how to judiciously add to or withhold facts, and is not sentimental in his parade of humanity, he is sure to do well, sure to affix a de or von to his name, and end his days in comfort. There is an example of what I am saying." And he glanced furtively at the weak-looking master of the sharp, intelligent servant whom I have called the chasseur. "Monsieur le Marquis would never have been anything but a miller's son if it had not been for the talents of his servant. Of course, you know his antecedents." I was going to make some remarks on the changes in the order of the peerage since the days of Louis XVI, going, in fact, to be very sensible and historical, when there was a slight commotion among the people at the other end of the room. Lackeys in quaint liveries must have come in from behind the tapestry, I suppose, for I never saw them enter, although I sat opposite to the doors, and were handing about the slight beverages and slighter viands which are considered sufficient refreshments, but which looked rather meagre to my hungry appetite. These footmen were standing solemnly opposite to a lady, beautiful, splendid as the dawn, but sound asleep on a magnificent settee. A gentleman who showed so much irritation at her ill-timed slumbers that I think he must have been her husband was trying to awaken her with actions not far removed from shakings. All in vain. She was quite unconscious of his annoyance, or the smiles of the company, or the automatic solemnity of the waiting footman, or the perplexed anxiety of Monsieur and Madame. My little friend sat down with a sneer, as if his curiosity was quenched in contempt. "Moralists would make an infinity of wise remarks on that scene," said he. "In the first place, note the ridiculous position into which their superstitious reverence for rank and title puts all these people. Because monsieur is a reigning prince over some minute principality, the exact situation of which no one has yet discovered, no one must venture to take their glass of eau sucre till Madame la Princesse awakens, and, judging from past experience, those poor lackeys may have to stand for a century before that happens. Next, always speaking as a moralist, you will observe, note how difficult it is to break off bad habits acquired in youth. Just then the prince succeeded, by what means I did not see, in awakening the beautiful sleeper. But at first she did not remember where she was, and, looking up at her husband with loving eyes, she smiled and said, "Is it you, my prince?" But he was too conscious of the suppressed amusement of the spectators and his own consequent annoyance to be reciprocally tender, and turned away with some little French expression, best rendered into English by, "Pooh-pooh, my dear." After I had had a glass of delicious wine of some unknown quality, my courage was in rather better plight than before, and I told my cynical little neighbour, whom I must say I was beginning to dislike, that I had lost my way in the wood, and had arrived at the chateau quite by mistake. He seemed mightily amused at my story, said the same thing had happened to himself more than once, and told me that I had better luck than he had on one of those occasions, when, from his account, he must have been in considerable danger of his life. He ended his story by making me admire his boots, which he said he still wore, patched though they were, and all their excellent quality lost by patching, because they were of such first-rate make for long pedestrian excursions. "Though indeed," he wound up by saying, "the new fashion of railroads would seem to supersede the necessity for this description of boots." When I consulted him as to whether I ought to make myself known to my host and hostess as a benighted traveller instead of the guest whom they had taken me for, he exclaimed, "By no means! I hate such squeamish morality." And he seemed much offended by my innocent question, as if it seemed an implication to condemn something in himself. He was offended and silent, and just at this moment I caught the sweet, attractive eyes of the lady opposite, that lady whom I named at first as being no longer in the bloom of youth, but as being somewhat infirm about the feet, which were supported on a raised cushion before her. Her looks seemed to say, "Come here, and let us have some conversation together." And, with a bow of silent excuse to my little companion, I went across to the lame old lady. She acknowledged my coming with the prettiest gesture of thanks possible, and, half apologetically, said, "It is a little dull to be unable to move about on such evenings as this, but it is a just punishment to me for my early vanities. My poor feet, that were by nature so small, are now taking their revenge for my cruelty in forcing them into such little slippers. Besides, monsieur," with a pleasant smile, "I thought it was possible you might be weary of the malicious sayings of your little neighbour. He has not borne the best character in his youth, and such men are sure to be cynical in their old age." "Who is he?" asked I, with English abruptness. "His name is Pousset, and his father was, I believe, a woodcutter or charcoal burner or something of the sort. They do tell sad stories of connivance at murder, ingratitude, and obtaining money on false pretenses. But you will think me as bad as he if I go on with my slanders. Rather, let us admire the lovely lady coming up towards us with the roses in her hand. I never see her without roses. They are so closely connected with her past history, as you are doubtless aware." "Oh, beauty!" said my companion to the lady drawing near to us. "It is like you to come to me, now that I can no longer go to you." Then, turning to me and gracefully drawing me into the conversation, she said, "You must know that, although we never met until we were both married, we have been almost like sisters ever since. There have been so many points of resemblance in our circumstances, and I think I may say in our characters. We had each 2 elder sisters, mine were but half-sisters though, who were not so kind to us as they might have been." "But they have been sorry for it ever since," put in the other lady. "Since we have married princes," continued the same lady, with an arch smile that had nothing of unkindness in it, "for we both have married far above our original stations in life. We are both unpunctual in our habits, and in consequence of this failing of ours, we've both had to suffer mortification and pain." "And both are charming," said a whisper close behind me. "My lord the Marquis, say it, and both are charming." "And both are charming," was spoken aloud by another voice. I turned and saw the wily cat-like chasseur prompting his master to make civil speeches. The ladies bowed with that kind of haughty acknowledgment which shows that compliments from such a source are distasteful, but our trio of conversation was broken up, and I was sorry for it. The Marquis looked as if he had been stirred up to make that one speech, and hoped that he would not be expected to say more, while behind him stood the chasseur, half impertinent and half servile in his ways and attitudes. The ladies, who were real ladies, seemed to be sorry for the awkwardness of the Marquis, and, addressing some trifling questions to him, adapted themselves to subjects on which he could have no trouble in answering. The chasseur, meanwhile, was talking to himself in a growling tone of voice. I had fallen a little into the background at this interruption in a conversation which promised to be so pleasant, and I could not help hearing his words. "Really, de Carabasco is more stupid every day. I have a great mind to throw off his boots and leave him to his fate. I was intended for a court, and to a court I will go, and make my own fortune as I have made his. The Emperor will appreciate my talents." And such are the habits of the French, or such his forgetfulness of good manners in his anger, that he spat right and left on the parquet floor. Just then a very ugly, very pleasant-looking man came towards the two ladies to whom I had lately been speaking, leading up to them a delicate, fair woman, dressed all in the softest white, as if she were vouée au blanc. I do not think there was a bit of colour about her. I thought I heard her making, as she came along, a little noise of pleasure, not exactly like the singing of a tea-kettle, nor yet like the cooing of a dove, but reminding me of each sound. "Madame de Miu Miu was anxious to see you," said he, addressing the lady with the roses. "So I have brought her across to give you a pleasure." What an honest, good face, but oh, how ugly. And yet I liked his ugliness better than most persons' beauty. There was a look of pathetic acknowledgment of his ugliness, and a deprecation of your too hasty judgment in his countenance that was positively winning. The soft, white lady kept glancing at my neighbour the chasseur, as if they had had some former acquaintance, which puzzled me very much, as they were of such different rank. However, their nerves were evidently strung to the same tune, for at a sound behind the tapestry, which was more like the scuttering of rats and mice than anything else, both Madame de Miu Miu and the chasseur started with the most eager look of anxiety on their countenances, and, by their restless movements, Madame's panting, and the fiery dilation of his eyes, one might see that commonplace sounds affected them both in a manner very different to the rest of the company. The ugly husband of the lady with the roses now addressed himself to me. "We are much disappointed," he said, "in finding that monsieur is not accompanied by his countryman, le Grand Jean d'Angleterre. I cannot pronounce his name correctly." And he looked at me to help him out. Le Grand Jean d'Angleterre. Now who was Le Grand Jean d'Angleterre? John Bull? John Russell? John Bright? Jean, continued the gentleman, seeing my embarrassment. Ah, these terrible English names, Jean de Giancouleur. I was as wise as ever, and yet the name struck me as familiar, but slightly disguised. I repeated it to myself. It was mighty like John the Giant Killer, only his friends always call that worthy Jack. I said the name aloud. "Ah, that is it," said he. "But why has he not accompanied you to our little reunion tonight?" I had been rather puzzled once or twice before, but this serious question added considerably to my perplexity. Jack the Giant Killer had once, it is true, been rather an intimate friend of mine as far as printer's ink and paper can keep up a friendship, but I had not heard his name mentioned for years, and for aught I knew he lay enchanted with King Arthur's knights, who lie entranced until the blast of the trumpets of 4 mighty kings shall call them to help at England's need. But the question had been asked in serious earnest by that gentleman, whom I more wished to think well of me than I did any other person in the room. So I answered respectfully that it was long since I had heard anything of my countryman, but that I was sure it would have given him as much pleasure as it was doing myself to have been present at such an agreeable gathering of friends. He bowed, and then the lame lady took up the word. "Tonight is the night when, of all the year, this great old forest surrounding the castle is said to be haunted by the phantom of a little peasant girl who once lived hereabouts. The tradition is that she was devoured by a wolf. In former days I have seen her on this night out of yonder window at the end of the gallery. Will you, ma belle, take monsieur to see the view outside by the moonlight? You may possibly see the phantom child, and leave me to a little tete-a-tete with your husband." With a gentle movement, the lady with the roses complied with the other's request, and we went to a great window looking down on the forest in which I had lost my way. The tops of the far-spreading and leafy trees lay motionless beneath us in the pale, wan light which shows objects almost as distinct in form, though not in color, as by day. We looked down on the countless avenues which seemed to converge from all quarters to the great old castle, and suddenly, across one, quite near to us, passed the figure of a little girl with the capuchon on that takes the place of a peasant girl's bonnet in France. She had a basket on one arm, and by her, on the side to which her head was turned, there went a wolf. I could almost have said it was licking her hand, as if in penitent love, if either penitence or love had ever been a quality of wolves. But though not of living, perhaps it may be of phantom wolves. "There, we have seen her!" exclaimed my beautiful companion. Though so long dead, her simple story of household goodness and trustful simplicity still lingers in the hearts of all who have ever heard of her, and the country people about here say that seeing that phantom child on this anniversary brings good luck for the year. Let us hope that we shall share in this tradition of good fortune. Ah, here is Madame Leretz. She retains the name of her first husband, you know, as he was of higher rank than the present." We were joined by our hostess. "If monsieur is fond of beauties of nature and art," said she, perceiving that I had been looking at the view from the great window, "he will perhaps take pleasure in seeing the picture." Here she sighed with a little affectation of grief. "You know the picture I allude to," addressing my companion, who bowed assent and smiled a little maliciously as I followed the lead of Madame. I went after her to the other end of the saloon, noting, by the way, with what keen curiosity she caught up what was passing either in word or action on each side of her. When we stood opposite to the end wall, I perceived a full-length picture of a handsome, peculiar-looking man, with, in spite of his good looks, a very fierce and scowling expression. My hostess clasped her hands together as her arms hung down front, and sighed once more. Then, half in soliloquy, she said, "He was the love of my youth. His stern yet manly character first touched this heart of mine. When shall I cease to deplore his loss?" Not being acquainted with her enough to answer this question, if indeed it were not sufficiently answered by the fact of her second marriage, I felt awkward, and by way of saying something I remarked, "The countenance strikes me as resembling something I have seen before, an engraving from a historical picture, I think, only it is there the principal figure in a group. He is holding a lady by her hair and threatening her with his scimitar, while 2 cavaliers are rushing up the stairs, apparently only just in time to save her life." "Alas, alas," said she, "you too accurately describe a miserable passage in my life, which has often been represented in a false light. The best of husbands—" Here she sobbed and became slightly inarticulate with grief. "Will sometimes be displeased. I was young and curious. He was justly angry with my disobedience. My brothers were too hasty. The consequence is I became a widow." After due respect for her tears, I ventured to suggest some commonplace consolation. She turned around sharply. "No, monsieur. My only comfort is that I have never forgiven the brothers who interfered so cruelly in such an uncalled-for manner between my dear husband and myself. To quote my friend Monsieur Sagnerel, there are little things which are occasionally necessary in friendship, and 5 or 6 sword thrusts between people who love each other only serve to reinvigorate affection. You observe the colouring is not quite what it should be?" "In this light the beard is of rather a peculiar tint," said I. "Yes, the painter did not do it justice. It was most lovely, and gave him such a distinguished air, quite different from the common air. Stay, I will show you the exact colour if you will come near this flambeau." And, going near the light, she took off a bracelet of hair with a magnificent clasp of pearls. It was peculiar, certainly. I did not know what to say. "His precious and lovely beard," said she, "and the pearls go so well with the delicate blue." Her husband, who had come up to us and waited until her eye fell upon him before venturing to speak, now said, "It is strange Monsieur Auger is not yet arrived." "Not at all strange," said she tartly. "He was always very stupid and constantly falls into mistakes in which he comes worse off, and it is very well he does, for he is credulous and cowardly fellow. Not at all strange. If you will," turning to her husband so that I hardly caught her words until I caught, "then everybody would have their rights and we should have no more trouble. Is it no, monsieur?" addressing me. If I were in England, I should imagine that Madame was speaking of the Reform Bill or the Millennium, but I am in ignorance. And just as I spoke, the great folding doors were thrown open wide, and everyone started to their feet to greet a little old lady leaning on a thin black wand, and "Madame la Fairy Godmother!" was announced by a chorus of sweet, shrill voices. And in a moment I was lying in the grass close by a hollow oak tree, with the slanting glory of the dawning day shining full in my face, and thousands of little birds and delicate insects piping and warbling out their welcome to the ruddy splendor. I think this story is so fun. It's another one that begs to be repeated once you know the trick of it and you have to go back to the beginning. If you do go back to the beginning, you will note that in the very first sentence, this story claims to be an excerpt from the letters of Richard Whittingham, Esquire. And you may recall some bit of English folklore around a character named Dick Whittington. While listening, you will have picked up on the references to Bluebeard and an ogre and Red Riding Hood and Jack the Giant Killer, and so it's clear that this party is a gathering of fairy tale characters. And then, of course, I want to trace them down a bit and figure out which story goes with which character. I believe that all the characters are specifically from the fairy tales of Charles Perrault, which makes it easier to figure out who they are. Obviously, the sleeping woman is Sleeping Beauty, and the woman with the little sore feet is Cinderella. I love how he mentions that she's so beautiful, but her hands are kind of worn and dirty. The woman with the roses is from the Perrault story called Diamonds and Toads. Fascinatingly, the little cynical man is, of course, Tom Thumb with his 7-league boots. And the pair of people with the servant constantly bossing around his master is, of course, Puss in Boots. When you read it closely, you'll notice the mention of the Marquise de Carabas from the story, and the servant talking about taking off his boots. He belongs at court. I cannot figure out who the cat-like lady is, the white Madame de Miu Miu and her ugly husband. Madame de Aulnoy wrote a French fairy tale about a white cat, and actually a Danish derivative version of that story is actually already on the channel. But all these other stories are from Perrault's fairy tales, so it seems weird that there is this one exception. Happily, assuming that these are characters derived from Perrault's stories gives me the justification to use these incredible illustrations by Harry Clarke. If you can figure out any of the stories or characters that I've missed, please do let me know in the comments. This brings us, of course, to Dick Whittington. Richard Whittington was a real man who lived from 1354 to 1423. He was a wealthy merchant's son, but he was a second son or something he was unlikely to inherit, so he went to London to trade. He made a lot of money, and he eventually transitioned to a career in politics, kind of a natural progression from being a leader in the trades to being a leader in the community. Like he was a councilman, and then he was an alderman, and then eventually he was appointed the interim mayor of London when the existing mayor had died. Now, a few years before that, the king had taken over ruling London because he said it was being mismanaged. But within a few days of Whittington being this interim mayor, he negotiated a deal for the city to buy back its rights from the monarchy and reestablish its independence, or its pseudo-independence, that weird privileged role that London has. So later that year, when there was a real mayor election, he of course won, and he was elected 3 times, and everybody in London loved him. He was also super rich, and he loaned out lots of money, especially to royalty and to nobility, so of course he had a lot of influence that he used to improve life in the city. And he never had any children, so when he died he bequeathed all his money to various charitable causes, some of which are still incredibly impacting English society to this day. Like he started a foundation that still distributes grants. He built an almshouse that people still live in. He started the original Guildhall Library, which still exists. Anyway, he was a beloved and revered figure. Now, for some reason, about a century after his death, his story got mixed up with some Persian fairy tales, and this story about young Dick Whittington, who grew up poor in the country and made his way to London with his cat, and who was kind and wise and lucky and made his fortune and had all these adventures, that is a completely different backstory that was kind of pasted onto this historic figure. But this fictional rags to riches story of his life has become incredibly culturally important, and the fable of Dick Whittington and his cat has been the subject of stories and songs and plays and pantomimes and all that stuff for centuries. So I think the whole conceit of this particular story by Elizabeth Gaskell is that the butler mishears our narrator introducing himself as Richard Whittingham, and hears him introduce himself as the mythical figure of Richard Whittington, and that allows him entrance into the party and everything else that follows. I think the ending, that final sentence, is just that kind of cop-out ending of maybe it was all a dream, but maybe the fairy godmother did put him to sleep in a grove of trees. I don't know. If you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. This week's confession is that once again, I'm a little bit discouraged about the channel. I'm getting even fewer views than I did when I started, and it is, discouraging. Not even because I thought this might be like a side gig that would make me a bunch of money, but it's almost exactly like every other form of social media. You know, you make your content and you put it out there. And of course you want it to get views and likes. And when the numbers just go down and down and down, it's really easy to internalize it as negative feedback. But before we go into like whys and wherefores and what I could be doing differently about the channel, I just wanted to say that as the backdrop to what I really want to talk about. There's another YouTuber named Sky. He's a fellow American turned Dutchie, and I stumble across his videos from time to time. And he made this amazing video called Why I Make Videos No One Watches and Why You Should Too. And I'll link it in the comments so you can watch it if you're curious. Firstly, this guy is just so positive and he always seems to be having a great time. And the point of this video is that for him, making hundreds of videos that no one watches has been a learning experience, and that learning that has created opportunities for him. And also, most touchingly, he says that if even only one person learns something or is helped or has a better day, that's all that one of his videos needs to do. In other words, he's out there trying to spread some light, bless him. Now, To be totally honest, I'm basically a do no harm kind of person, and it's actually taken me years to get here, but I would like to become a spread some light kind of person. And of course, the original purpose of this channel was essentially selfish. I wanted to read certain kinds of things, and I wanted to create a platform where I could find like-minded people to share and discuss them and react to them. And I am absolutely getting a huge amount of enjoyment out of that. Some of the comments on this channel are so interesting and insightful, and they invite me to think of these stories in such different ways, and that's lovely. And it's a huge compensation for the constant negative feedback in the form of my stats. But Sky, in that video, has really invited me to reframe for myself what I'm doing here and why, and I'm thinking about it, and I am grateful for that. If you are curious and love learning new things, or if you just want to help me spread a little light, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Please also drop a like on this video or leave me a comment below with your thoughts on this story or anything else. And of course, if you'd like to support me any further, consider buying me a coffee with the link in the description. Thank you so much, and I will see you in a few days.